Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Boggs. I'm the Executive Director of Open Communities Alliance, and I wanted to start by just thanking everyone for being here. I also wanted to thank our sponsors. We have platinum support from Garden Homes and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, gold sponsorship from the Connecticut Housing Authority and the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, along with People's United Bank, and silver sponsorship from the William Casper Graustein Foundation, bronze sponsorship from the Center for Leadership and Justice, the Connecticut Realtors, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, and the Chef Movement. We're really grateful for all of that support. We're also honored tonight to have as our moderator, Cara McClellan, Assistant Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Cara works on the cutting edge of civil rights litigation, focusing on issues such as school segregation, discriminatory school policies, school financing, racially conscious admissions. She has authored and contributed to a range of reports and law review articles addressing issues of race and civil rights. And this is a bit of a virtual homecoming for Cara, who graduated from Yale College and Yale Law School. Cara also has a degree from the Penn Graduate School of Education, and there's more about her in your program booklet. And with that, I'll hand it off to Cara.
Thanks, Erin. It is great to be here for this discussion. And it's really a follow-up from last time's discussion, where we learned about the history of segregation in the Hartford region and how it is the result of conscious decisions by state and local officials to maintain racial isolation in schools and in neighborhoods. And we heard from long-time Hartford residents about how they have navigated their own personal decisions about where to live and where to send their kids in school in the face of this reality. So today we will explore a variety of tools for intentionally unwinding segregation and the inequities that continue through geographically enforced racial lines. We know that segregation isn't going to go away on its own. It's something that we have to actively address. So we have an exciting agenda tonight that will begin with Open Community Alliance's Outreach Director, Taniqua Huguley, who will share a presentation on the impact of segregation. You can find a full bio for Taniqua in the program booklet. I encourage everyone to take a look at the booklet for the bios of our panelists who really bring a wealth of experience and expertise. Taniqua will provide the context, and then we will hear from others on the panel tonight. And we're going to get into a discussion about strategies to desegregate and to actively disrupt this history that has reinforced white supremacy. So more later on, but first let's turn it over to Taniqua.
Thank you, Cara. Let me share my screen. Okay. Good evening, everyone. As Cara said, my name is Taniqua Huguley. I am the Outreach Director for Open Communities Alliance. So today I'll start off our discussion with talking a little bit about the impact of segregation in Hartford County. Open Communities Alliance is a Connecticut-based civil rights nonprofit working with an urban and suburban interracial coalition to advocate for access to opportunity, particularly through promoting balanced, affordable housing developments, including in thriving communities. I'm gonna hop right in. Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the nation. Connecticut is more segregated than many states in the South, and this is shaped by several factors, such as zoning, subsidized housing locations, disinvestment, history of intentional segregating policies, and limits on housing authority jurisdiction. And I'll go into a little bit to talk about housing policies and segregation. There have been deliberate policies in place that perpetuated racism, such as redlining. Up until today, just recently, Redfin has been brought on a suit and accused of redlining. In the 1930s, banks denied Black people financial services and loans when they attempted to purchase homes in certain neighborhoods. Places where Black and immigrant families lived were given low ratings, making it harder for families to get the assistance needed to live in those neighborhoods. Housing segregation is not accidental. In our Out of Balance report, we demonstrate this. We answer some of the following questions in this report. What areas of Connecticut are thriving, struggling? How do these neighborhood assessments interact with race and ethnicity? And I'll be sure to share the link to this Out of Balance report that OCA did. A lot of people talk about, I'm sorry, hold on. Erin, can you please mute yourself? A lot of people talk about the achievement.
Yeah, I'm muting my, sorry, Taniqua, so you're on presenter view, so you might try to switch the view if you can, and I'll mute myself now.
I'm sorry. Oh no, what's happening? What did she say? Desktop 2. Are you able to see? Okay. Okay, so I apologize for that. A lot of people talk about the achievement gap, but we should really look at the overall picture of the factors that influence a person's life. So I like to talk about the opportunity gap. Education, employment, and neighborhood quality are 3 indicators that shape the levels of opportunity. OCA combines these 3 opportunity scores to come up with a final opportunity score, and we look at things such as school ratings, median income, employment access, home ownership rates, poverty rates, and more. And then that allows us to produce our opportunity maps, which look like this. And so this is our updated 3.0 opportunity map. And we use these indicators. OCA was able to create that, to develop these opportunity maps, which show the stark difference between opportunity levels in the state of Connecticut. There are 5 different levels of opportunity ratings, from very low opportunity to very high. The darker the orange color represents thriving towns, low poverty rates, low crime rates, high employment rates, and thriving schools. Pay attention here. This is our opportunity map layered with the number of people of color throughout our state in Connecticut. So pay attention to the areas where you see the blue darts are clustered. So 1 dot is about 250 people of color. These clusters are found in low and very low opportunity areas. Here is the Hartford area, here's the New Haven area, and the Bridgeport area. Racism has been identified as a public health crisis. Many of us already knew that, but at the beginning of COVID-19, this topic kind of took off, specifically in the state of Connecticut, and we heard mayors and governors throughout the nation starting to declare racism as a public health crisis. For example, one thing here that we found in our opportunity map, once we layered it with health disparities in the state of Connecticut, we saw that there was a stark difference in life expectancy rates and asthma rates. This is an example of Hartford compared to West Hartford and Glastonbury. And the asthma rate for folks in Hartford was 154.2 per 10,000 per population, and life expectancy rate was 77.5 years, compared to our neighbors in West Hartford, where life expectancy rate was 85 years, and in Glastonbury, 80.2 years. And so these are 2 suburban towns that identify as high and very high. And here in Hartford, we are identified as a very low opportunity area. So health, declaring racism as a public health crisis is not just a statement. This is something that is real, and the numbers show. This is a closer look at opportunity levels in Harford County. And if you can see here, this is where Hartford is located around some of our partners, our suburban partners that identify as moderate, high, and very high opportunity. This is a glimpse of Hartford's racial change over the years. As you can see, Hartford became the hub of concentrated poverty in the county. Hartford was once the richest city in the world. It was the financial center and insurance capital. And due to the change and the concentration of poverty, that is no longer the case for the city of Hartford. So where do we live? Today, 26% of the white population in Connecticut live in very high opportunity neighborhoods compared to 4% Blacks, 8% Hispanics, and 27% Asians. More than half of the Hispanic and Black population in Connecticut live in low and very low opportunity areas. As you can see here, 68% of the Hispanic population and 74% of the Black population in the state of Connecticut live in low and very low areas compared to 25% of our white population. So 2% of the land area of the state is considered very low here in Connecticut. And almost half of the Black and Hispanic population in Connecticut live in the 2% of the state that is considered very low. So yes, where you live matters. We know that several disproportionate factors such as employment, education, income, and housing shape the opportunity for people. I think it's important to also note that aside from the racial wealth gaps, we also have huge disparities in things such as education, crime, incarceration rates, unemployment rates, and affordable housing affordability rates as well. So here, this is just a map that depicts the racial wealth inequality throughout the nation. The wealth disparity is projected to widen for people of color, having only 1% of the wealth that whites have. Okay, and I'll wrap up quickly. So I talked a little bit about the affordability in Connecticut. The National Low Income Housing Coalition found that Connecticut is has the 10th highest housing wage, and that we would have to make, or someone would have to make $26.42 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental home, and they would have to work 96 hours a week, which is the number of hours needed at the minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. And so, as you can see here, the different shades on this map shows the hourly wages required to afford a 2-bedroom home by state. So the state of Connecticut is not doing too well. So just to wrap up quickly, some of the solutions that we suggest is that bring an impactful and effective investment to communities in lower opportunity areas. We need that here in Hartford. Ensure that families truly have a choice in where they live. Ensure that there are affordable housing choices in higher opportunity areas for all, and ensure that all towns of Connecticut take on the fair share of affordable housing. And this is something that Erin will talk about later today. These are a few suggested reads that I have. I'm happy to send any of these links to the folks that are attending tonight. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back over to Cara. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me via email or phone. Thank you.
Thank you, Taniqua, for really laying out what's at stake. So we're going to move from here to talking about solutions. And we're going to start with Erin Boggs, who of course is the Executive Director of Open Communities Alliance. From there, we'll hear it from Philip Tegeler, who is the Executive Director of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council in Washington, D.C., and one of the founding board members of OCA. From there, we'll hear from Professor Anika Singh Lemar, clinical professor at Yale Law School in the Ludwig Center for Community and Economic Development. And then we'll go to Jennifer Rangel, Planning and Community Outreach Director at the Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas, Texas. And then from there, last but not least, we'll hear from Ashley Blount, who's a Hartford-based community organizer working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, amongst other hats that she wears. So first, we're going to start with Erin. And again, we encourage everybody to take a look at the bios of our distinguished panelists and of Taniqua and all of the expertise that they bring. But to get right into the discussion, Erin, segregation is obviously a complicated issue. And one of the questions that often comes up is how can we think about development and reinvestment in ways that empower Black and Latino communities that are so often left out of redevelopment. So we're going to start off with you really framing this and other issues for us.
All right, and I'm going to put up, share my screen, and we'll go from there. All right, are you seeing my screen? No? Here, let me try one thing.
We're seeing your screen.
Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
We are. I think it just needs to be made larger.
Yep, so it'll do that in 1 second. All right.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you for, is it the presenter view or the appropriate view?
You're all set.
Oh, good. Okay, well, great. We're in business. So I'm going to just frame this out a little bit and sort of talk about how to put some of the solutions into buckets, and then talk about a few solutions that we've been playing with here in Connecticut. You know, when we think about the impact of government-sponsored segregation, it's clear from the statistics that there are racial disparities. But when we're thinking about these, you know, about how to really map out solutions, we need to consider the direct results of the history of segregation in terms of race and place. And when we dig into that a little further, we see that what has played out is a real lack of choices for families needing affordable housing. Those families are disproportionately Black and Latino, and higher resource areas have really been off limits. And then we also see this systemic disinvestment in areas that have historically been communities of color, often creating pockets of poverty concentration, and then putting such communities at risk of further disinvestment or displacement, and at risk of gentrifying pressures. So, you know, considering that framework, we can then think about the solutions in 3 buckets: federal solutions, state level solutions, and town level solutions. And across all of those, what's really important is data collection and goals. And that at a certain level sounds boring, but it's really the cornerstone of making change. We also see the importance of organizing and advocacy, and then how we can use, in the federal example, federal investments to really drive change in disinvested communities, always, I think, with input from local residents. We can also see federal tools put to use to promote meaningful integration and reinvestment. And then we need to sit back, and I think we now have a chance to do this with a new administration. We need to reimagine federal programs and how they affect states in place, especially understanding the history. At the state level, there are all kinds of ways to direct resources in a way that counteracts the history of segregation, and especially how we've used subsidized housing and the way that the state oversees zoning. And then there's a whole list of other state policies that really embed systems of segregation that we need to investigate and unwind. And at a town level or a city level, that use of organizing is important. We'll hear a little bit about how planning and zoning can be leveraged to create sort of a new vision for places, and particularly in cities. And then we'll also hear a little bit about school policy and how important that is to this entire issue. So very quickly on data and goal setting, we saw some of the data that Taniqua had. The short version is a picture's worth 1,000 words, and the more we can use data to demonstrate how government policies are continuing segregation, the more we're going to be able to lift this up as an issue and then craft solutions, including setting goals to address the issue. And this map right here is just a map of our opportunity map with the location of subsidized housing laid on top of it. And you can see the concentration in lower opportunity areas, which are also disproportionately Black and Latino. A second area where we can do some work is housing authority jurisdiction. Housing authorities in Connecticut can be established by towns basically for a number of different reasons that are all connected to the lack of affordable housing and safe and sanitary dwellings. But once a town has established a housing authority, that housing authority can only operate within the town itself. So thinking about this in terms of, one example, the use of housing choice vouchers, a federal program that is available on a lottery basis to families who are at 50% of area median income or below. The program expects families to pay a third of the rent on the open market, and then the program covers the rest up to a certain cap. Well, this program is important to really unpack, considering the racial dynamics. So if you look at who participates in the program in Connecticut, almost 80% of voucher holders are Black or Latino. So that should instantly raise some flags and cause us to look a little harder. Another aspect of the program is about 43% of participants are female-headed households, which at least under the Fair Housing Act is another protected class that warrants, I think, further scrutiny when you see a program particularly helping that group. And then we look at where voucher families are living. And almost 70% of them are living in lower opportunity areas that are disproportionately poverty concentrated and disproportionately have high levels of families who are Black and Latino. So something is going on here that we need to unfold a little bit. And when we look at this, we see layers of barriers. We have to look at where affordable housing is located. We have to look at how vouchers are valued in terms of what they're worth in the market. We have to see what kind of information voucher holders are given about neighborhoods. We have to look at how housing authorities require, in most cases, voucher holders to live in the town where the voucher was issued. And then we have to look at all the red tape and costs for families to move out of their original town after the first year, which is typically what happens. And also understand that housing authorities lose money when a family leaves their town. All of these things, in one way or another, can be addressed if we expand where housing authorities can operate to go beyond town lines. And some of these issues would be completely solved. Others would actually we'd make some good inroads and probably have more advocacy to do. But this is an example of a very specific state policy that we can change through legislation this session and see some really big differences. The other thing to remember is that this policy has been in place for decades and decades and decades, limiting generations of families who've used vouchers and need affordable housing in other ways from really having choices in where they live and concentrating affordable housing in neighborhoods that are disproportionately of color. So the last thing I want to talk about is reversing exclusionary zoning. Again, data is really important here. We've seen here in Connecticut over the last couple of weeks, additional data coming out on how exclusionary towns have been. OCA is also working on a report that will dig even deeper into that issue. We've been working in the town of Woodbridge, and just by way of an example, in the town of Woodbridge, 0.2% of the land area is available for quote unquote multifamily housing. That multifamily housing can only be duplexes and can't be 3 units or more. So that's an example of a real problem. And we need to be thinking in terms, as Cara said, of proactive measures. And I have this picture of a desert here because one analogy to think about is a forest that has been completely cut down and has turned into a desert. And to fix that problem, you can't simply stop cutting down the trees. You have to take proactive steps to bring water, to avoid erosion, to plant new trees, to bring in new soil, to counteract that history. And that's how I think of fair share zoning, the solution that OCA recommends to address the exclusionary zoning that the state has experienced for decades and decades. So in a nutshell, the way that fair share zoning works is this. You assess the need for affordable housing, and in some cases, like in New Jersey, that assessment is made by a court. That number of affordable housing units is allocated out to towns in a way that is fair and considers their capacity and their contributions to solving the affordable housing needs in the past. And then towns have the opportunity to develop a plan, looking at how they're going to address and zone and plan for meeting their fair share. And ideally, these plans are very specific, looking at particular parcels of land and identifying developers. So note that the towns are really in control here. They get to create a plan. The only challenge comes is if a town doesn't create a good plan that works. And if in that case, what happens in a state like New Jersey is the town can then be challenged if they don't have a court-approved plan by a watchdog nonprofit, or a developer can come to town, buy a piece of land, and get approval from a court rather than the town zoning. So that's a big step, but it only happens if the town hasn't created a meaningful plan. In New Jersey, the towns can zone for a spectrum of income, so it's across a whole range of affordability. And what New Jersey towns have used to reach their fair share are really two tools. One is inclusionary zoning, and I think we'll hear about that a little later. And the second is federal and state housing subsidies. And this has really worked in New Jersey. They're on track to create 100,000 of affordable housing. I think they're at about 83,000 now, with agreements to do the remaining to reach that 100,000. And it's something we need to think about here. What OCA has done is we've run the numbers. So we've got that affordable housing need number. And all these presentations will be available on our website. We've got additional information on our website, but this map represents the need across regions in the state. And we've done it for the Hartford area. So we've got that mapped out as well. So I'm going to stop there, but I just wanted to share that as one example of a way to tackle exclusionary zoning, tackle restrictions on where housing authorities can operate, and emphasize the importance of data and goal setting. So thank you.
So Professor Lemar, turning to you now, as we've heard, so many of these decisions are made at the local level, or in the case of Connecticut, at the town-based level, really. So what are some other solutions that people can be thinking about at the town-based or even on the state level?
Thanks, Cara. And I want to thank Taniqua and Erin and OSPA for having me tonight. This is a really phenomenal panel to be a part of, and I appreciate that ability to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and here we go. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit, as Cara prompted me to talk about tools that one might use to de-design segregation. And the message that I'm going to try to convey here is that we need to stop tiptoeing around imaginary lines. Talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. I'd like to start off conversations about solutions for segregation with this anecdote out of Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a phenomenal book that many of you may have read about the Great Migration. She talks about one of the people she interviews about his experience with the Great Migration is a surgeon in LA who grew up in a small town in Louisiana. And he describes this really deep regret he has from his childhood that he never learned how to roller skate. And he explains to her that the reason he didn't learn how to roller skate was not because his parents couldn't afford roller skates. His parents were school teachers. They were confined to teaching in segregated schools, so I'm sure woefully underpaid, but nevertheless could have afforded roller skates. But the thing that they could not afford were sidewalks. And on the Black side of town in Monroe, Louisiana, where he grew up, there were no sidewalks. Somewhere between the white section of town and the Black section of town, there was an imaginary line. And on one side of the line, there were sidewalks, and on the other side, there were not. So notwithstanding the ability to, the sort of bootstraps, he could have gotten roller skates. The thing that his family could not afford was the public resource that was segregated, and that was sidewalks. And the fact of the matter is that the earliest zoning codes were precisely designed to segregate resources like sidewalks. That was the point of them. Jessica Trenstein, a political scientist, in this 2019 book, Segregation by Design, explains that as local governments across the country began to spend more and more money on infrastructure, they also spent more and more time adopting regulations that ensured that that infrastructure was confined to white neighborhoods. So streetlights, sidewalks, sewers. The way to make sure that those resources, that you're only spending money on white people was through zoning. And single family zoning is really a central component of that history of sort of ensuring that public infrastructure goes to well-off people and white people, but not to low-income people and people of color. Today, the resources that zoning segregates are, yes, parks and sidewalks and the like, but also primarily schools. We all kind of intuit that, but it's important to kind of make it plain and say it out loud. So zoning is one kind of sort of imaginary line that's important here, but here in Connecticut, there's another one, which is really just our school district lines, which in Connecticut, unlike most places in the country, are our town lines. And I share this headline from a New York Times Magazine issue from 4 or 5 years ago. It's an article by Nicole Hannah-Jones about the school district secession movement, which is really nationwide, a nationwide phenomenon of disproportionately white, disproportionately well-off small towns seceding from larger school districts. And I recall when this article came out, there was also a series of articles in Vox. There was like a lot of public recognition of this big problem of, oh my gosh, can you believe that these tiny white enclaves want to secede from larger, more diverse school districts? Isn't that crazy? Aren't people in the South so racist? And this article was about this small town, Gardendale, Alabama, that is 18,000 mostly white people seceding from a more diverse county-wide school district. And I remember thinking, aren't people in the South so racist? The people of Gardendale just want what the people of Avon and Wilton here in Connecticut already have. Avon, Connecticut and Wilton, Connecticut, just by way of example, are about 18,000 people each, disproportionately white. Gardendale is 14,000 people, disproportionately white. We already have the system that the school district secessionists in other parts of the country are trying to quote unquote achieve, drawing imaginary lines that allow them to have disproportionately white enclaves where property taxpayers can be sure that their property tax dollars are only going to educate their children, but not those children over there. So it's important in turning to solutions, it's important to kind of recognize what the problem is. And we are kind of privileged to live in an era where there's actually a lot of great new scholarship really documenting the empirics of things that many of us have known for a long time. So exclusionary zoning is not a new concept, but this sort of social science that documents the causation and correlation between single family zoning, large lot zoning, and homogeneous white neighborhoods and communities is relatively new. So here's one recent paper out of California that found that detached single family only zoning resulted in disproportionately white neighborhoods. They also found that the more opportunities you give for neighbors to object to development proposals, that citizen opposition also ended up leading to the exclusion of potential residents of color. Similarly, Jessica Trenstein, again, in a more recent paper, describes how you get more exclusionary zoning in whiter places, and that exclusionary zoning then works to keep those places white. And again, empirically, in a recent paper, goes back through the last 40 years of zoning history. So what does exclusionary zoning look like? These are the things we'd want to tackle if we wanted to deal with solutions. So large lot zoning, single family only zoning. requirements that developers of multifamily or affordable housing have to go through approvals processes in places that are already disproportionately white and well off, any kind of duplicative regulations. And then, you know, as we saw on the examples of Gardendale and Wilton, teeny tiny homogenous enclaves that get to make decisions for themselves tend to self-perpetuate their teeny tiny homogenous enclaveness. So those are all kinds of things that you have to tackle. It's important to recognize how bad we are here in Connecticut. So just getting at some of that empirics that we have access to today that maybe we didn't have access to 20 or 30 years ago, even though we've known that exclusionary zoning is a problem for a long time. A colleague of mine at Yale Law School, who has been writing about exclusionary zoning since the 70s, is in the middle of a project of actually examining zoning codes in suburban New Haven County, suburban Silicon Valley, and suburban Austin, and has found that the minimum lot size requirements in New Haven County, outside of New Haven, outside of the city, the suburbs, are dramatically more restrictive than they are even in Silicon Valley, which is renowned nationally for its extraordinarily high housing prices and exclusionary zoning. We are off the charts in terms of how much land we require per unit of housing here in Connecticut. And New Haven's numbers are pretty similar to Hartford's in Fairfield County. The entire sort of 95-91L corridor has pretty similar zoning practices. It's also important, I think, to recognize the timeline when all of this is happening, because Connecticut used to permit the construction of starter homes. Like once upon a time, it was possible to build a house affordable to a middle-income family in the suburbs. But right around the time of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, exclusionary zoning blows up in the state of Connecticut. So this is just an example in the Hartford region and Avon. As Avon begins to suburbanize, you can build a house on a 15,000 square foot lot that's under half an acre, less than half an acre. Today, you cannot build a new house, a new construction house on less than half an acre. In Avon, the vast majority of town is zoned for 1 and 2 acre lots. And it's worth noting that, you know, even if the Fair Housing Act of 1968 had magically solved housing racism, which it did not, as Taniqua described, and as Susan Eaton described at the previous session, you would have a situation where at the time that the housing market opened, government closed the door through zoning. Okay, so in terms of solutions, one thing is to simply decrease the need for conditional approvals, the variances, special exceptions, rezonings, all of those kinds of zoning approvals that we make people apply for if they want to develop multifamily housing, we should do away with. And there's recent empirics on this too, that when you have community process around zoning in suburban towns, the people who show up are disproportionately white, disproportionately old, disproportionately wealthy, disproportionately opposed to the construction of affordable housing. Like the people who show up to the hearings hate new housing more than people who stay home. And they had a really sort of cool mechanism by which they were able to measure that. And that the opposition predictably results in fewer units, fewer affordable units, and more parking, which drives up housing costs. People think about the approvals process as an effort, as an opportunity for kind of local input. Well, the local input, regardless of where you are, always drives in the same direction when you're talking about the suburbs, and it's less housing, more parking, less affordability. And these are just some examples from around Connecticut. This is one from Greenwich and it's just straight out of a newspaper article, the kinds of things people say. And I think we're all pretty sensitive to the idea of dog whistles these days. And if you look down this list of things that people say, you know, some of these things are not dog whistles, they're people whistles, as I started to say at the beginning of the Trump administration. It's not that hard to read into these, the kind, you know, what people are worried about. This is sort of very, very typical. And this, you know, I think it's like a 250 unit proposed development did not end up getting built in the town of Greenwich. Here's one from Middlefield, Connecticut, closer to where we are tonight, where, you know, one speaker said that Middlefield residents want to live near quote unquote nice people, not apartments, because apparently those are mutually exclusive things. Okay, so here are some proposed solutions, removing this kind of bias, this opportunity for bias to make its way into the process. And really what it boils down to is permitting multifamily housing as of right. I mean, this is really anathema to a lot of Connecticut suburban towns. You just kind of need to permit multifamily as of right in order to make it possible to build it. And it's not that crazy. The entire state of Oregon has banned single family only zones. And a number of municipalities, like large cities, have done it as well. But it is possible to do this at the state level. And what does that mean? I mean, it means that this is a zoning map of Guilford. You know, Connecticut today, already under Connecticut law today, every town's required to zone for multifamily housing. Erin's already told you that in Woodbridge, 0.2% of the land area is zoned for duplexes. You know, this is the town of Guilford. It's a pretty similar situation to Woodbridge. On the left is the full zoning map. In order for me to show you the multifamily zones, I have to zoom in on the right to this like really zoomed in version. And even then, this tiny arrow right here is where you can build 2 family houses as of right in Guilford, and that's it. So obviously that's not meeting the spirit of the law. It's probably not even meeting the letter of the law in terms of permitting the construction of multifamily housing. Meanwhile, you can build this mansion in Guilford today, no problem. I'm sure you can also build it in Woodbridge and Avon and Greenwich and any number of these towns. Again, no problem, no approvals whatsoever. But if you're seeking to build this 4-family house, which is what Erin and I will be before the Woodbridge Town Plan and Zoning Commission later this evening discussing, this 4-family house has to go through months upon months upon months of approvals processes where we hear a lot of the same kinds of things that those folks in Greenwich and Middlefield said in those previous slides, and that's crazy. So another, one way to think about this is just to think about modularity. This is a single family house in New Haven, except no, just kidding, it's not, it's a 2-family house. And there's no reason that this sort of thing should not be permitted throughout the state of Connecticut. Thanks, Taniqua, I'm just about done. Another possibility here, in addition to multifamily housing, traditional multifamily housing, is accessory dwelling units. A lot of towns are now considering ADU regulations. This is a nice schematic from the state of New Hampshire, which at the state level requires every single town to permit the construction of ADUs. That just shows you the way, the forms these can take in an attic, in a garage, in a basement. It doesn't change the kind of general bulk of the neighborhood at all. It's pretty compatible with Connecticut's sort of historical architectural patterns. And Oregon's and other states, these are just some examples of states that at the state level that have said, no towns, you cannot prohibit ADUs because that's dumb. I just want to end. I feel a little bit silly, frankly, going after Susan's presentation and Taniqua's presentation and saying to you that there's this massive segregation problem in the state of Connecticut, which there is, and saying to you, oh, we can solve it with ADUs. I mean, the fact of the matter is we cannot solve it with ADUs. The zoning solutions here are necessary, but they're really only first steps. And this, I just think, is a really poignant quote from an educator, Richard Bury, in the New York Times from a few months ago, that I think is really important to just note, that the tools that we oftentimes throw at segregation are so much smaller than the tools we use to build the segregation, that I think we just need to keep the scale of the problem and the solutions in mind. And because this is a problem we're going to be solving for a long, long time. And I just want to turn back for a second to those school district lines. It's also important to know what we're up against. In the not too distant past, there were efforts to regionalize school districts here in Connecticut and to get rid of some of those teeny tiny 18,000 people, disproportionately white school districts. And the upshot was this, massive resistance. And I don't say those words lightly. These are mothers of massive resistance of the sort that we saw in the South post Brown v. Board. This is a sort of silly graphic, but when I think about how fiercely people defend their school district lines, I think of my kids playing The Floor is Lava. Like, the floor is not really lava, but they're definitely jumping from the couch to the next door chair. And this is what it feels like. This is what the school district lines feel like to me. Like you could just, the floor is not lava. You could walk across it and we could solve some of this problem that way. And instead you get the same kind of massive resistance to regionalization of school districts here in Connecticut as you saw, and almost the same exact signs, stop forced busing, as you saw in the aftermath of Brown v. Board in the American South in the middle of the century. And with that, I'll just close. You know, we should got to stop tiptoeing around the imaginary lines that keep some kids from well-resourced schools and well-resourced libraries and well-resourced parks and playgrounds and well-resourced transportation. And I hope to join you all in that fight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Lemar. And I have to just really underscore, as a school desegregation litigator, the point that you just made about Gardendale, because the reality is that the only reason, as you said, white parents in Gardendale did not have a majority white school, like some parents in racially isolated towns in Connecticut, is because of desegregation litigation, is because of the fact that there had been lawsuits to desegregate Jefferson County. And that was the reason that when succession happened, my colleagues at LDF were able to challenge succession because there were ongoing lawsuits. And so it just goes back to our point about it's going to require affirmative action and affirmative interventions. It's not something that's going to get addressed on its own. So I have to just shout out my colleagues who are litigating that case and who were able to raise the succession issue, which unfortunately is coming up in many of our desegregation cases. It is a present and current form of white resistance. So with that, we want to zoom out a little bit and talk about solutions, which is what, of course, we're here tonight to talk about solutions, not just the problems, and in particular solutions at the federal level. So we're going to turn here to Phil Tegeler, and our question for you is, with this new administration in the White House, what are the most pressing rules and regulations we should be paying attention to that could impact fair housing in Connecticut?
Thanks, Cara. I guess I wanted to start answering that question with this extraordinary executive order that President Biden signed 2 weeks ago. Basically admitting the federal government's role in, segregation and disinvestment in Black communities in the United States. He repeatedly says the 20th century, of course. He doesn't mention the 21st century, but nonetheless, it's the first time an American president has made this kind of admission. And it's really a platform for some pretty dramatic steps that the federal government under President Biden can take to redress segregation on many levels. It's a really significant step. It's also the basis for the Biden administration's promise to reinstate the two really important civil rights rules that were passed at HUD under the Obama administration, which were suspended by President Trump: the disparate impact rule under the Fair Housing Act and the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which I'll talk about a little more. The affirmatively furthering fair housing rule has an enormous amount of potential to affect what happens here in Connecticut and to change the conversation and give more leverage to local activists. And we haven't talked about this in a while because it was suspended by the Trump administration in 2018. But the four key elements are very relevant to our conversation today. In particular, the requirement that jurisdictions subject to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule identify the factors contributing to segregation in their area and develop concrete goals to address segregation. Importantly, at the time, this is a timeline of the AFFH rule passage, suspension, and hopefully reinstatement later this year. At the time the AFFH rule was suspended in January, HUD had not yet gotten around to applying the rule to state governments and public housing authorities. It only applied initially to local governments. And we think at PRAC that the application of this law to state governments is where a lot of the action is going to take place. State law and state governments are the primary driver of housing and school segregation, as reflected in Anika's comments. They control local land use and zoning. They control how school districts are set up, where the school district lines are, et cetera, et cetera. The basic structures of segregation are controlled by the state. And likewise, the application of this rule to public housing authorities is going to be really the new frontier in the next few years after the rule is reinstated. This is repeating some of the things that others have said, but I think these are some of the things that Connecticut can do to comply with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule as it moves forward. The governor and the Department of Housing in Connecticut can obviously do a great deal to implement these types of desegregation goals in Connecticut. But some of the most important steps here are in the lap of the state legislature. And there's really going to be a need for organizing, litigation, and many kinds of pressure to get a suburban dominated legislature here in Connecticut to take action. I would call out here in particular the importance of exercising caution when Connecticut receives a huge influx of new federal housing dollars. There is a big appetite in Congress and in the executive branch to dramatically expand all forms of federal housing assistance, starting with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the Housing Trust Fund, and even the Public Housing Program. People are talking about expanding that. When you look at a highly segregated, fragmented state like Connecticut, those dollars in that housing is desperately needed for people in Connecticut who are eligible for assisted housing. However, that kind of money coming into the state presents a real threat of further segregation here in Connecticut if it's not utilized carefully by the state. One thing that Connecticut should also be doing is enforcing its own affirmatively furthering fair housing law. Connecticut, everyone's been talking about California and the new California affirmatively furthering fair housing law, and legislation in Massachusetts and New York, and the new Boston affirmatively furthering fair housing ordinance. But in fact, Connecticut had the first affirmatively furthering housing ordinance or statute in the United States in 1991. There were these two laws in 1991 that the legislature amazingly passed. One is a broad affirmatively furthering law applying to every housing agency in the state, including the State Housing Agency, shall affirmatively promote fair housing choice and racial and economic integration in all programs they administer. And then there's some subsections of this law which apply to particular programs. It's a very powerful mandate. And likewise, the Zoning Enabling Act, which Anika mentioned briefly, requires housing choice and economic diversity in housing, including housing for both low and moderate income households in every zoning code in every town in the state of Connecticut. Now, what's kind of sad about these, both of these really innovative and important laws is when they were passed, they were enforceable. There was a general standard in Connecticut law that you could enforce laws like this. You could go into court and enforce them. A number of years later, Connecticut law evolved, and the Connecticut Supreme Court adopted, in a case involving Public Act 91-362, a federal standard that says if you don't explicitly say the law is enforceable in the law itself, it's not enforceable. That was never the standard in Connecticut. And after about 2005, it's now the presumptive standard. And all Connecticut really has to do here, the legislature, is nothing too radical. They just have to declare these two laws, which have been on the books for 30 years, enforceable in court in a private right of action. And that will make a huge difference to organizations like OCA and their ability to move forward with fair housing enforcement. Finally, I wanted to say a few words about housing in schools. You know, we obviously know that housing segregation directly affects school segregation. And in fact, the government role in housing segregation was an original element in the Sheff v. O'Neill case many years ago. It was subsequently taken out of the case for a variety of reasons. The flip side is also true, that schools affect housing segregation and in a really destructive cycle of opportunity hoarding in exclusionary towns and disinvestment in schools in towns that are open to low-income housing. This is a very dramatic cycle that we've seen deepen over the last 40 years in Connecticut. But the one bright spot is that is the Sheff v. O'Neill system of magnet schools that is developing and has developed over the last 20 years. The line on this map is meant to be a school district line, and research has shown that school district lines are the primary driver of economic or income segregation in this country. And that's really where the regional system of schools comes in. We often talk about the need for regional school districts. I think politically that may be a long way off here in Connecticut. But at least here in the Hartford area, we have the beginnings of a regional school district with our system of magnet schools, which is beginning to decouple residential location from school quality. In other words, the more choices we have regionally in our magnet schools, the less urgent it will be for affluent or middle-class families to hide in affluent suburbs to get an allegedly better education. If we can expand this regional magnet system in Hartford, and at the same time open up more seats to low-income children in exclusionary school districts through some of the housing mechanisms we've talked about here, and at the same time invest in Hartford neighborhood schools for families who want to send their kids to the neighborhood school, we're going to start to see a real reduction in housing segregation in the region, at the same time as we expose more children to the benefits of school integration. So this is a bigger topic, of course, but this is a reciprocal relationship between housing and school segregation, and also a reciprocal relationship between housing and school integration that we should really think more carefully about harnessing. And in fact, at the end of the Obama administration, there was an instruction to the state of Connecticut and the other 50 states from the federal secretaries of housing, education, and transportation that state agencies in charge of education and housing should work together to promote fair housing and school integration. And we're very much hoping that that direction, which is also part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, is going to be reinstated by President Biden and Secretary Fudge in the near future. So with that, I will pass it on.
Thank you. So from here, we're going to move into talking about organizing efforts because we know that real change requires a sustainable and well thought out organizing strategy. So first, we're going to turn to Ashley to hear about work she is doing locally to ensure that as COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic continues to really devastate all communities, that we are paying attention to the ways that historically disinvested communities are being impacted in even more dire ways and in ways that are really crystallized by all of the disparities that we've been talking about tonight. So Ashley, we will turn it over to you from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Cara. Just want to note where I come from in this, and just want to ground us in the time that we are in right now. As we know, the state of Connecticut has been in shutdown since March of 2020. Thousands of folks have lost their jobs. Hundreds of folks have been evicted from their homes. And in those evictions, in those families that have been removed from those homes, we have to keep in mind that also there are students that are living in those homes. And I just want to pause there because in this panel, as an organizer, I have no slides to give you, no numbers in that way, but being on the ground and speaking to these folks one-on-one, just if you can hear the sincerity of my voice and the emotionality that is coming out, that is what I'm getting from the people that we are talking to every day who are in danger of being removed from their homes. So there has been relief put in place. And with that, a lot of the onus and the pressure has been placed on the tenants to ensure that they can file for a rental relief or rental assistance that has been provided by the federal government and by the state. We do know that with this process, there has been a state ban on evictions. However, with those evictions, with those bans, there are some lines. And again, the lines, it puts more pressure on those who are directly impacted than it does the landlords. I do have some numbers. I will give you some figures in terms of Hartford. When we think about how many tenants there are opposed to landlords, in Hartford itself, there are 76% of folks who are tenants and the 24% who are landowners. That is majority of the city of Hartford. So when we think about the evictions, when we think about folks who are being directly impacted, those are people of color and primarily Black families. In housing court, the largest demographic that is represented are Black women. We do know in these households that there generally, the standard is 2 children that are in each household. So if we think about last month in January, over 500 eviction cases were processed. If we times that by 2, we think about 1,000 children who have been removed from their homes. The state has provided some visions of relief, but it has not been clear. The eviction moratoriums that has been put in place by Governor Lemar, they generally come during the last week of the next month, which means people are sitting on pins and needles, waiting for Governor Lemar to extend this eviction moratorium. That leaves a lot of stress, a lot of pressure on tenants, and also there's a trickle-down effect on that. As we know, COVID-19 has disrupted us mentally, emotionally, physically. We can't go and do as we used to, and this does play a part to the students that are in the home. So what happens with the eviction, with the state eviction ban? Since now in January, landlords are now able to file new eviction cases. If a tenant owes more than 6 months of rent that was due on or before March 2020, if the tenant owes rent that was due on or before February 29th, 2020. If the landlord can say tenant actions created a serious nuisance, or the lease has expired and the landlord wants to use the tenant's residence as their primary residence. This does not provide any space for folks. So the pandemic exposed quite a bit that exposes their dismiss way of looking at the oppression and segregation. It's even more disregard when the eviction moratorium is extended for a single month at a time, leaving endangered residents in constant stress. There was a state program, THARP, that was created at the beginning of the response to aid residents affected worst by the pandemic. That program was given $20 million in funding. In September, that promise it did double that with total amount of $40 million. However, that rental assistance program, THARP, only spent $27 million before it was closed on December 3rd. So organizers are asking the question, what happened to the remainder $13 million? There was a new program that was started. Funds were distributed by the federal government. The state of Connecticut received $237 million in federal emergency rental assistance that is allocated only for rental funds. As of current, we have not received a public plan from the Housing Committee and how they would disperse those funds. According to federal regulations, they have until September 9th to disperse those funds, or the funds will be reassessed and can be reallocated. The last START program, as you know, there's still money left over. There are funds that the state of Connecticut has, and they're not being allocated to those who need it the most. We are seeing the same thing happening in Hartford, where students were given subpar laptops. Many students were unable to log in online, and they were unable to learn. Hartford Public School Board also received funds, but we're also calling back for those laptops and also for those things. Another thing that is putting the pressure and onus on those who are directly impacted. So I know this is a lot of complaining on what is wrong and not really a solution. And I understand that. But at this time, there is an urgency for us to all come together and come up with the solution that does not put the pressure, does not put the onus on those who are directly impacted. And that is what I have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for really poignantly describing how COVID has laid bare the inequities that are maintained along segregated racial lines, as we've been talking about. So we wanted to end with you, Jennifer. Your work has focused on designing long-term organizing strategies to disrupt inequities in Dallas. So if you could share with us what you have learned and about what strategies have been successful for you as we think about these issues.
Yeah, well, hello everyone. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you again for the invitation, for having ICP to be here. I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll dive right into the conversation. We've heard about the power, the influence zoning could have in a lot of people's lives. And so this presentation is focused on how do we take that power back? How can folks who haven't benefited from what zoning should be doing, which is promote the public health, safety, and welfare, what can they do in that case? So we'll go ahead and get started. Just really quickly, I'll briefly touch on who we are, who is the Inclusive Communities Project, our approach, and then dive right into the conversation. So the Inclusive Communities Project is an affordable fair housing organization in the North Texas region. We are a nonprofit organization with a three-part mission. First, we focus on the creation and maintenance of thriving, racially and economically inclusive communities. We work towards the expansion of fair and affordable housing opportunities for low-income families. And lastly, which highlights this presentation specifically, we work to redress for policies and practices that perpetuate the harmful effects of discrimination and segregation. And so our approach is within the neighborhood equity and options lens. Neighborhood equity meaning, how do we facilitate equity in the historically redlined and underserved and abused neighborhoods? Options meaning, how do we ensure that housing voucher renters are able to access housing in safe, well-resourced, low poverty areas outside the inequitably racially isolated neighborhoods. Some quick definitions. You've heard at this point what I mean by neighborhood equity, but focusing on the word equity itself, equity meaning a principle that calls for fairness, inclusion, and justice. It requires concrete actions and steps and should be designed that take into account the historical and contemporary injustices and the unequal outcomes we see. Racial equity as well, meaning when race can no longer be used to predict the life outcomes, and outcomes of all for all groups are improved. And so why is neighborhood equity so important? Why? Because we've heard and we've seen how people's housing experiences have and still are negatively impacted by public and private processes and decisions. Here are just some quick examples, and the previous presenters have highlighted, and it's also been discussed in the part one of this webinar. And so someone else already mentioned it, so I highly recommend checking out the book, The Color of Law, because it really does touch upon how the government segregated America. And there's also a short film, and I went ahead and linked it on here, that kind of summarizes the book to give you some type of perspective of the power at play. And so what are some of today's inequities? I'll dive into some quick examples of some data research that have been used to inform neighborhood equity. First one is the diversity data kids. When we look at the DFW region in Texas, we see that often Black and Latinx children often do not have access to the well-resourced low poverty areas. And so that begs the question of how can opportunities exist in all neighborhoods, but at the same time, how can people have the option to live in the historically off-limit areas? Next, there is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which basically tells you the level of resilience of communities, resilience from things such as natural or human-created disaster or disease outbreaks. In the city of Dallas, there has been an analysis of zoning as it relates to industrial zoning, and research did find that often in numerous locations, City of Dallas single-family zoning neighborhoods, Black and Latinx neighborhoods, are often located next to heavy industrial. Which I would like to highlight is one where air pollution was examined, and again, the findings touch on how communities of color bear the burden of heavy air polluters close to where they live. So what are others doing in response to some of the inequities I've touched upon? I'll briefly talk about two particular neighborhoods in Dallas that are taking head-on using a neighborhood-led grassroots approach to find some solutions. The first one I'd like to highlight is the 10th Street Historic District, which is a local and national freedmen town, meaning it was a neighborhood where former enslaved Africans and their descendants settled, and with sacrifice and commitment established their own neighborhood. This was a neighborhood that was also redlined, and fast forward to recent years, they have also observed a series of demolitions of structures that consequently led to the neighborhood to being listed in local and national endangered lists. However, the 10th Street Residential Association has made its presence known at City Hall by speaking up at hearings. They have representation on city task force groups and continuously give back to their community. And last year, they decided that it was time for them to create their own neighborhood-led plan to address the vacant lots, pressures of gentrification, and overall to preserve their historic neighborhood. Another neighborhood I would like to also highlight is the Floral Farms neighborhood in Dallas that continues to deal with the racism and injustices of the past. Residents live next door to industrial activity that has negatively impacted their quality of life. In recent years, it is also where an illegal toxic mountain of shingles, yes, a mountain of shingles, had resided for years behind someone's backyard. The mountain is now moving thanks to allies and thanks to the ongoing efforts of allies and the neighborhood. But the work is far from done because the neighborhood continues to deal with pressures of industrial activity. There's no park in the neighborhood, there's no library, there's no other neighborhood amenities. However, the neighborhood has stepped up and have put in the hours to work towards the future they want, the vision that they aspire to see for their community. The Neighborhood Self-Defense Project is a collaboration between Southern Sector Rising, which is a coalition of residents in Dallas, Downwinders at Risk, a grassroots environmental justice group, and ICP as a fair housing organization. And collectively under the project, we've assisted Neighbors United, and they've received technical assistance and have created their own neighborhood plan draft. They are now in the phase of advocating for the plan to be adopted at the local level in the city of Dallas. Bottom line, we have to meet people where they are because communities of color continue to deal with the racism of the past. And so what are neighborhood-led plans? Essentially, it's a way to capture a community's vision and priorities. On the screen, I have some examples of what it can include, but basically why it's so important to articulate and have a vision written in a document is because it can inform decisions such as zoning, future zoning cases, and investments. Each plan is unique because it's tailored specifically to the neighborhood. If you are interested in diving in about how that is possible and how it can be created, I do encourage you all to check out the Neighborhood Self-Defense Project linked on this slide, but also in this presentation. It is a curriculum a colleague of mine in the field, Evelyn Mayo, and I have developed. And we also have on the website a draft of the Floral Farms neighborhood. If you want to just dive in and take a look at what that means when communities take ownership and take the lead of the vision they want in their community. But basically, we wanted to create a process where it doesn't matter if you don't understand what zoning is or the difference between land use. This process helps people understand how they could create an impact in the future of their community. And so they learn along the way as we create this plan alongside with them. And we've heard urban planning is a tool and it's been used in the past that led to many of the injustices we've seen today. But seeing its impact, we can also recognize that urban planning tools should be used to also address the inequities they help to create in the first place. The neighborhood planning efforts work in tandem with an advocacy training. It's not just about creating a plan, it's an entire comprehensive and collaborative effort that includes things such as letter writing, speaking at public hearings, writing opinion pieces, being active in public participation processes, social media, building allies. That's just to name a few. And so here are just some quick resources of a few things that I briefly touched on today. And with that, I thank you all.
Thank you. So we are going to open it up for discussion now and want to hear your questions. So please put them in the box if they haven't been answered already, and we will get to them from all of our panelists. So just to kick it off, one question is, as we are in this moment where there is a lot of conversation around how to be anti-racist, especially in the wake of the killing of Mr. George Floyd and a awakening for some people about the realities of structural racism, how can we answer this question of how to be anti-racist when it comes to segregation in housing and in schools? Is there advice from our panelists that you would give people who are asking themselves this question right now? How can I be anti-racist? How can they implement this concept of being anti-racist and thinking about segregation in housing and also in education?
I can try to go first, I guess. So I think there's a couple different layers to answers to this question. I think Connecticut's not the only state, but it is. There are multiple efforts going on right now to address systems change around where housing that is affordable because it's government subsidized, or affordable simply be constructed on a smaller scale, on smaller lots, or in multifamily apartment buildings, to do systems change around where that housing goes. I think there's tons of opportunities in Connecticut right now, one of which is to get involved with Open Communities Alliance to support change in your own town. There are many towns around the state that are considering affordable housing applications on almost every month in a Fairfield or a Westport or the like. There is a multifamily housing application, and typically the only people who show up to those hearings are against. As I said, those hearings disproportionately attract people who are anti. So if you're even just one of 3 or 4 people who show up to your local zoning hearing and say, actually, I think affordable housing is good. Actually, I'm okay with children attending our schools, even if their parents are not paying $20,000 a year in property taxes, because their house isn't a $20,000 a year in property taxes house, then that can make a massive difference, just because so few people actually do that. I do think it should be said, though, that if you're a white or privileged parent, you have the luxury of not having to participate in segregation. So you don't have to, I mean, it may be news to some people, but you don't have to live in Avon, right? Your children have the benefit of the resources that you bring to them, and they will be fine in Hartford or New Haven or Bridgeport Public Schools. My kids are more than fine in New Haven Public Schools. And you can opt to simply say, frankly, if I'm not going to spend money at Amazon, then I'm sure as heck not going to send property taxes to the instruments of segregation in the state of Connecticut, which is to say these local towns that close off their doors to low-income people and people of color. So that's, there are many levels upon if you are a person with privilege, you have so many choices and you can exercise them in ways that are not supporting these institutions.
Yeah, I definitely echo everything that Anika said. I think just generally, right, just educating yourself first and speak out, like Anika said, speak out and speak up and hold your neighbors accountable, hold your elected officials accountable, and educate yourself. If you're not familiar with any of these topics, find out what's happening in your town, participate in the planning of your affordable housing plan or your planning and zoning plan. And specifically for this session, right, it's online. So usually it was hard to get to the Capitol and testify and things of that sort. But now we're virtual, right? So I would definitely encourage people to take advantage of this session and, as Anika said, speak out for things such as bills that align with, inclusive communities. For example, and I can share in the chat, OCA has some policy priorities that we're open to sharing, and we hope that you can advocate with us. I think also I think the biggest thing is also just educating yourself and holding your elected officials accountable, because if no one speaks up, then they just make the decisions, or they don't consider it a priority issue. As far as housing, if you're a landlord, it's illegal not to rent to Section 8 holders or anyone with vouchers. And so if you're not familiar with the program, educate yourself and find out about the program. And there are families that are interested in living in suburban communities. So help us open up the rest of the communities throughout the state. So that's just a few ways of being anti-racist.
Another question that has come up in the chat, and I know we're running short on time, so we're gonna maybe limit it to 2 people responding. Is desegregation the only way to provide economic, educational, environmental, et cetera, equity for Black and Latino and other marginalized populations? And the commenter says, I was struck by the panelists in the first session who grew up in segregated settings in Hartford, but weren't comfortable with that. So responses from our panelists.
Yeah, I think one of the keys here is to make sure there's a range of choices available. I mean, there are families who want their kids to participate in the open choice program, for example, but live in Hartford. There are families who want the opportunity to move. There are families who want the opportunity to stay. I mean, that's one thing we have found when we've had the opportunity to actually interview or survey families with Section 8, for example, is that there's a range of interests. People are people, and they have different opinions about what they want, what kind of choices they want available to them. So I think that's why it's so important to have a variety of options. I think it's why it's important to make sure that people have full information about different opportunities available to them. And it's why those, all of these efforts need to move forward full steam.
Yep, and I would just add, obviously we're far from the day where segregation is something that we can choose to not be involved in. So, the idea that we can either choose to opt in or opt out is not a reality. We have to be actively disrupting segregation before we can even talk about free will in which we're making choices. Another question in the chat box. Local politicians point to the state zoning laws as to say much of the zoning practices are out of their control, but most of the representatives and senators are from suburban areas. How do we escape such a cycle and place more accountability and responsibility on the towns and municipalities?
I mean, one thing that we're looking at and promoting is this notion of fair share, where you have a real obligation on the part of towns to do something, and something that's enforceable. We also have, the current laws that Phil was listing are on the books right now. And while there's not a private right of action, there are some other tools to get at a way to enforce those. So, I think we really need to push forward on the laws we have and create new laws that really mean something.
But it is a really good reminder of how important it is for people who do live in suburban towns to contact their representatives and senators, because if you're in Glastonbury, Avon, West Hartford, Simsbury, et cetera, it's your reps and senators who don't hear or not from the people who think that these issues are important. And all they're hearing is the other side of, no, I don't want that housing, or those people who live there here. So be the counterpoint to that, be the counterpoint to that messaging. Your voices are so important.
Yeah. And when the Open Communities Alliance comes into your town threatening to sue, you need to stand up and support the Open Communities Alliance.
Or just asking to have a conversation. I heard a story from, this is a suburban town in New Haven County, where someone was really, supportive of affordable housing, wanted to have a discussion about it with their first select woman, and went up to her and said, "Oh, I want to talk to you about affordable housing." And her reaction was, don't worry, we're not going to let it into town, not understanding that she was actually talking to someone who supported more affordable housing. So I would like, that kind of pushing to happen so that that's not the default assumption that our elected officials are making.
So I think we are coming up on time now and want to be respectful of everybody's time on the line. Thank you for joining us and for this wonderful event. I'm going to turn it over to Taniqua to send everybody off. We have wonderful resources in the chat box, so I encourage everybody to look there.
Thank you. On behalf of OCA, I would like to thank everyone who came out for part 1, who came out for part 2. And thank you to our wonderful moderator, Cara. Thank you to our panelists, Jennifer, Ashley, who had another commitment tonight, the life of an organizer, Phil, Erin, and Anika for joining us this evening. Special thank you to our sponsors, Garden Homes, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, People's United Bank, the Graustein Fund, Center for Leadership and Justice, Connecticut Realtors, Federal Home Loan of Boston, and the Chef Movement. Thank you so much. Thank you for this dynamic conversation. This event was recorded. Part 1 was also recorded. It will be uploaded to our website and our YouTube site as well. All of the resources that were mentioned this evening will be sent to everyone who registered. So thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time. We won't keep you from your families. And one more thing, as Phil and Anika both mentioned, they mentioned, take part in OCA activities. If you're not a part of our coalition, please join our coalition. It's under the Take Action tab on our website. If you live in a suburban town, if you're interested in conversation about some of the things we discussed today, just feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to have a conversation with you and your neighbors or your church. And thank you again. This is the conclusion of our 2-part series for de-designing segregation in Hartford. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot us an email. Thank you again. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.